I was sorting through a box of old photographs last winter, the kind that accumulate in the back of a closet and never quite get organized. And I came across a picture of myself at 61. I was standing in my kitchen on what must have been a Sunday afternoon, and I looked tired in a way that I recognize now as a specific kind of tired. Not sick, not sad, just the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running a system that does not work and has been doing it for long enough that the inefficiency has become invisible. I held that photograph for a while, and I thought, I know exactly what was wrong. I know what I was doing that was draining me, and I did not stop doing most of it for another several years. Not because I lacked the intelligence to see it, but because I lacked the permission to change it. The permission or the information. Nobody had told me that what I was doing could be done differently. Nobody had said, you are making this harder than it needs to be. That is what I want to say to you today. Or more precisely, what I want to say to the version of you who is at 60 or close to it, because the things I would stop doing are things that tend to consolidate in those years and then become harder to question as the decade goes on. If any of this sounds like something you are currently doing, I am not saying that to point a finger. I'm saying it because I did it too. And I wish someone had said something sooner. Tell me in the comments as we go whether any of this resonates with where you are right now, or where you were. I think the conversation around this is genuinely useful. The first thing I would stop doing is cleaning my house in long, exhausting marathon sessions. For most of my adult life, I cleaned on weekends. Saturday morning or Sunday afternoon, I would undertake the house as a project, moving from room to room for 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 hours, trying to address everything that had accumulated during the week. By the time I was finished, I was genuinely spent. By the time the following Saturday arrived, enough had accumulated again that the cycle simply repeated. The house was clean for approximately 1 afternoon a week and in a state of maintenance the rest of the time. What I eventually understood, years later than I should have, is that this system was not a fact of housekeeping. It was a choice I had made once, very early in my adult life, and then never examined again. The alternative, which is to do small things daily and continuously, rather than everything at once, produces a cleaner house with less total effort and without the particular misery of a dedicated cleaning day. I do not really clean my house. I just tend to it every day in small ways. That sentence took me until my late 60s to understand, and I wish I had understood it at 50. What the daily maintenance rhythm also gave me, which I did not anticipate, was a different relationship with the house itself. When you clean in a single long session, the house is either in a state of need or in a state of completion, and the completion is always temporary. When you tend to it in small ways every day, it never gets far enough from good that you feel behind. The house stops being a project and becomes something more like a living arrangement between you and the space. I would have understood this at 60 if someone had described it to me. As it was, I understood it in my late 60s and have not cleaned any other way since. The second thing I would stop doing is keeping objects in my home because getting rid of them would feel like waste. I held this belief so deeply and so unexamined for so long that I did not even recognize it as a belief. It felt like a value. But what it actually produced was a house full of things I did not use, did not particularly like, and was not able to see clearly because they were surrounded by more things I did not use and did not particularly like. The accumulation justified itself by volume. Everything stayed because getting rid of any of it required overcoming a resistance that had no real foundation. My daughter-in-law Yuki, who grew up in Osaka and has a way of looking at the material world that I have come to find quietly clarifying, once said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that an object you keep out of guilt for getting rid of it is not a kept object, it is a hostage. I was keeping hostages in every room of this house. The clearing that eventually happened, when I finally did it, was not a loss. It was, to use the word she would not use, but that I will, a relief. The third thing I would stop doing is attending social events and maintaining obligations because I believed I was supposed to want them. There is a category of social life that consists not of things you genuinely enjoy, but of things you have always done, that your presence at is expected, that would require a conversation you do not want to have in order to stop attending. I spent an enormous amount of energy in my 60s on exactly this category. And I think of that energy now, the hours and the preparation and the recovery from events that left me feeling emptier than I had arrived. And I understand it as a genuine cost that I paid for a long time without questioning the invoice. What I would tell my 60-year-old self is this: the conversation you are afraid to have is almost always shorter and less consequential than you are imagining it to be. People who genuinely care about you will accept your honesty. People who do not accept your honesty are providing you with information that is worth having. In either case, having the conversation is more useful than spending the next decade showing up to things that do not serve you. If you enjoy this channel and want to support my work, just look directly below the video player, right next to the subscribe button, and click the button that says join. That is how you become a Smart Organizer. Smart Organizers members get exclusive videos, a loyalty badge in the comments, and custom channel emojis. I would love to have you there. There is also this. The social energy that I recovered by stepping back from obligations I had been fulfilling out of habit did not disappear. It went somewhere. Into conversations I actually wanted to have, into relationships that were genuine rather than dutiful, into afternoons I spent doing things that mattered to me rather than things I had agreed to before I fully understood my own preferences. The reduction was not a shrinking. It was a clarification of what was actually there. The fourth thing I would stop doing is treating rest as something to be earned. I worked hard at 60, not in the punishing way of certain earlier years, but consistently, continuously, in the background of everything. And I had developed a very firm and entirely unconscious belief that rest was the reward that came after sufficient output. You could lie down when the list was finished. You could sit quietly when there was nothing left requiring your attention. Since the list was never finished, and there was always something requiring attention, I was perpetually behind on rest in a way I did not recognize, because I had always been behind on it. What changed for me was understanding that rest is not a reward. It is maintenance. The body at 60 requires deliberate, scheduled recovery in the same way that a house requires maintenance, not as a treat when everything else is done, but as a regular and firm part of the week. I would have been healthier at 65 if I had understood that at 60. I would have had more energy for the things I actually wanted to do. The rest I was withholding from myself was not a luxury I could not yet afford. It was an investment I kept deferring. The practical change I made was to begin treating rest the way I had learned to treat small daily cleaning, not as an event that follows completion, but as a regular scheduled part of the day that happens regardless of whether everything else is done, because everything else is never done and never will be. A short rest after lunch, an earlier bedtime on certain nights, the permission to stop in the middle of the afternoon because my body asked me to. These are not indulgences. They are the reason I am still functioning well at 72. The fifth thing I would stop doing is managing my home for an imaginary audience. I kept certain rooms in a state that suited visitors more than it suited me. I owned furniture I did not particularly like because it looked appropriate. I arranged things in ways that I thought would read correctly to someone walking through the front door, rather than in ways that made my own daily experience more pleasant. I was, in some sense, staging my own house rather than living in it. This is a specific kind of quiet abandonment of the self that I think is more common among women of our generation than we tend to acknowledge. We were taught, in ways both explicit and ambient, that the appearance of the home was a statement about us, and that the audience for that statement included every person who might ever see it. I am not sure when I stopped believing this entirely, but I remember the first time I rearranged a room for my own comfort rather than for its appearance from the door. And I remember the disproportionate satisfaction of it. The house has felt more like mine ever since. I want to stop here and ask, is this one you recognize? Performing the house rather than living in it? Leave a comment below because I think this particular thing deserves its own conversation. What I found when I stopped staging and started simply living in the rooms was that my preferences were clearer than I had assumed. I actually knew what I liked. I had opinions about arrangement and color and texture and light that had been suppressed by the question of what was appropriate. When I stopped asking that question, the house became visibly more itself, which meant more mine, in ways that took very little money and very little effort. The changes were mostly subtractions, things I stopped doing rather than things I added. The sixth thing I would stop doing is delaying small pleasures indefinitely. I had a tablecloth I loved that I kept for special occasions. I had a set of candles I saved for when something worth celebrating happened. I had books I was going to read when I had more time, a particular recipe I was going to attempt when the moment felt right. The special occasion did not come. The more time never materialized. The candles eventually lost their scent, and I discarded them without ever having lit them, which seemed to me, when I noticed it, like a small and entirely avoidable loss. The Tuesday afternoon when I light a candle for no particular reason and use the good tablecloth because I want to eat my dinner in an environment I find pleasant is not a lesser occasion than whatever occasion I was saving it for. It is, in fact, the occasion. The life I am living on an ordinary Tuesday is the life I am living. I would have come to this understanding sooner if I had allowed myself to ask, at 60, what exactly I was waiting for. I do not think I could have answered that question. I think the inability to answer it would have told me something useful. The seventh thing, and the one that took me the longest to name clearly, is this. I would stop assuming that the way I had always done things was the way they needed to be done. I was 60 years old and I had 40 years of household management behind me, which sounds like a qualification, but which was, in practice, a set of habits so established that I had stopped examining them entirely. I cleaned the way I had always cleaned. I organized the way I had always organized. I managed my time the way I had always managed my time. The systems were old and some of them were not working, and I did not see it because they were the systems, full stop. What unlocked this for me was not a single conversation or a book or a dramatic moment. It was a gradual accumulation of small observations, some of them from other women, some of them from my own willingness to ask, in passing, whether there might be a different way. The willingness to ask that question, simply and without any attachment to the answer, turns out to be one of the more useful things a person can practice at any age. At 60, I had that willingness intermittently. I would tell myself to practice it more consistently. The version of me that sits down to a Tuesday dinner with the good tablecloth and a candle lit for no particular reason is a version that required permission I did not give myself for a long time. I give it freely now. I would have given it at 60 if I had understood that Tuesday was the occasion, that this ordinary life was the life, and that waiting for something more significant before allowing myself its pleasures was a way of not quite living in it. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, the button is just below. I post new videos regularly on topics like this one, and I would love to have you here. I want to close with something I think is important. This list is not a list of failures. These are not things I did wrong because I lacked intelligence or discipline or care. They are things I did because they were the patterns I had inherited, are constructed without examination. An examination is something that comes more naturally with time and more slowly than most of us would prefer. The 60-year-old in that photograph was doing her best with what she had. What she did not have was someone telling her, plainly and without drama, that some of what she was carrying did not need to be carried. If you are at 60 right now, are approaching it, or somewhere nearby, this is that conversation. You do not have to keep cleaning the way you have always cleaned. You do not have to keep the furniture you do not love. You do not have to attend the things you do not want to attend. You do not have to earn your rest. You do not have to stage your house for an audience that, for the most part, is not paying nearly as much attention as you believe. And you do not have to wait for the special occasion. That is what I would tell her. That is what I am telling you. Tell me in the comments which of these 7 things you are working on or have already let go of. I am always glad to hear where you are in this. And if this is the first of my videos you found, welcome. I would be glad to have you subscribe. I will see you in the next video.